Hi everybody, my name is Matt Svensson, and along with Amber German and Shelly Ann Malcolm, we did our facilitating learning presentation on storytelling. Um, Many years ago, when I was in 7th grade, I had an English teacher who would use stories to tell us or teach us how to spell certain words that he had found difficult for students through the years. One of those words was amateur, and he told us a story about a tourist that got lost in the Australian outback. And this man was wandering and came across an old man living in a shack in the outback. And the old man said, "Well, are you lost?" And the tourist said, "Yeah, I'm having a little bit of an issue here. I'm kind of an amateur." And the Australian man stopped him and said, "Nope, when you're in the outback, a mate you are." And I always remember that ever since that day um, that I've had to spell the word amateur, it's a mate you are. And it really illustrated for me um, how strong storytelling is. 20 years later, I still remember that lesson because of the use of a story. So it's uh, it's interesting to have that come full circle now and be able to teach something to you all about what storytelling can do for your uh, classes and your teaching in the future. Now, you might be wondering what exactly storytelling is. It's pretty straightforward. Storytelling is the conveying of events in words, sounds, and/or images, often by improvisation or embellishment. Stories have narratives that have been shared in every culture as a means of entertainment, education, cultural preservation, and instilling moral values. Um, in a narrow sense of the word, it refers specifically to oral storytelling, and in a looser sense, refers to a narrative technique in other media. Um, as far as cultural preservation, education, things like that, storytelling has been around forever. It's It predates writing. Every culture has some form of storytelling, whether it's through sitting around at campfires and sharing with younger generations tales of ancestors, um, storytelling for religious purposes, storytelling for educational purposes or entertainment purposes. Even now, we have Hollywood and our playwrights and TV creators and producers who know that the use of a good story can be extremely entertaining. It also serves for educational and cultural historical purposes. Education, my example of my teacher using a story to uh, teach how to spell specific words. You wouldn't think that a story would be used for something as inane as remembering how to spell a hard to teach word, but it can be. Storytelling can be used for a wide variety of things. It teaches us things about our culture, um, things about religion, historical things that serve purposes of helping us to learn values or morals. The story of George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and then saying that he couldn't lie, he did it. Um, while it might not be true, that we found out later, it still serves to teach values and morals. Now, with the advent of writing stories being recorded, transcribed, and shared, um, we have things like the Brothers Grimm stories, Hans Christian Andersen, Joseph Jacobs. All of these were written adaptations of oral stories, which were originally told in German, Dutch, and English. Now, it's believed by most historians and psychologists that storytelling is one of the many things that define and bind our humanity. Across all sorts of cultures, we have stories that translate the human experience, and we can share those no matter where you live, what culture you're part of. Storytelling in education, I believe, is a very, very important thing. Number one, storytelling is one of the best ways to get people or to engage people. And engaging our learners, which has been proven, um, helps memory immensely through a variety of things. Um, Now, why should we use it? You can provide clarity. If you have an extremely difficult spelling word, a complex uh, structure, or some sort of involved process that you need to teach, telling a story to go along with that to show how that process comes about is a great way to provide clarity. You can also create a lasting and powerful image with a story. If you use descriptors, if you can place somebody there, if you can get them into the Australian outback to see the sand, to smell the smells, hear the sounds of being lost in Australia, it provides a stronger image for you to remember that story. You can also help aid in the memorization of factual material. Telling a historical narrative helps us to remember dates, events, things that took place so we can learn from those things. And it's also more compelling than just data. I'd personally much rather hear somebody tell me a story to teach me than to ask me to memorize a graph or a chart or a table. Um, Stories appeal to both your head and your heart. It helps us to learn those things that we need, those things that can be provided by a graph, a chart, a table, but it also emotionally invests me. It pulls me in. Um, to continue that, you activate emotions. If you can elicit a visceral response, you're going to draw people closer to you and to the lesson. Now, humans naturally relate to stories. We all have our own stories, so it's easy to respond and become engaged when someone else tells you their story or a story of somebody else. It's one of the most powerful tools for shaping the feelings and thinking of others. Our politicians use stories to do this. Um, they make us laugh. Or sometimes they try to. They use stories of people to tug at our heartstrings, relating to whatever policy they're trying to get put into place. So it's one of those things that is definitively known that stories can help to shape our thoughts and actions and what we believe. Now, the attributes of a good story, you got to have a hook. You have to have something that pulls people in. Um, it has to be relatable. People aren't going to stay engaged and involved if they can't relate to your story. I wouldn't necessarily tell a story about hunting if I was talking to a room full of vegetarians. It's not something they can relate to. They'll shut off. Um, you also want to take out the filler. As Brock had explained, we've got about 15 minutes before we start to lose our participants and our students. So if you just fill your story full of things that don't really need to be there, you're going to have some attrition with the attention people pay. You're also going to want to keep that story in line with your lesson. It doesn't make sense to tell a story about something that has nothing to do with what you're teaching, which seems like a pretty obvious point, but I think a lot of times people have a tendency to digress. So you want to make sure that you stay away from those digressions too much. And you also want to make the ending of your story a strong takeaway. Wrap everything up. Put everything into a nice little bow. If you're teaching a value or a moral, make sure that you end with that. If you are teaching a lesson that the story serves to illuminate, make sure you end with what that lesson was. Wrap everything up and make sure that your takeaway is what you end with. Now, attributes of a good storyteller. You've got to have a strong voice. It doesn't mean you need to shout, but you shouldn't be as soft as a mouse. You want to have a voice strong enough and carrying enough that you're capable of those dynamics, because there are going to be points when you want to soften down and talk lighter and lower to illustrate um, what the point of that particular part of the story is. Or you may want to get louder and let people know that this is, a climax or a higher point in the story. So having a strong voice and an even voice to begin with allows you to be dynamic in your speaking. Maintain eye contact and also be honest. I think those two go hand in hand. Uh, People are not going to be engaged and pay attention if they think that you're lying to them or if they think that you're not trustworthy as a storyteller. So maintaining eye contact and being honest are two things that will keep people engaged because people are really good at seeing through a lot of those things. You're going to want to use vivid language. Now, by vivid language, I mean heavy descriptors. When you put somebody into your story, let them be there by using colors, describe sounds, smells. How did something feel? How did something make you emotionally react? Because that will actually help to put somebody into your story. It'll make you as the narrator more believable. It will make you and your story stronger and elicit a stronger response. You can also use movement to emphasize. Now, that's not to say that you need to speak with your hands and everything needs to be a wild, grand gesture, but if you want to show how big something is, you can use your hands. You can get closer. You can draw away during those particular points in a story where it makes sense. Now, the application of storytelling. When should you use it? The short answer to that is anytime it makes sense to use a story, you can use a story. It's a great opening activity, as Tate said in our Sit and Get chapter 15, which we were actually to read by Sunday the 17th, I believe. We need to the brain remembers best what it hears first, and second best what it hears last. So a great time for a story, something that helps people remember things anyways, is to open your activity or your lesson with that story, or close. You can also use it throughout all of these times because people remember the first thing and the last thing so well. If you don't have a story for both of those, but you have a story for something in the middle, that's great because people will remember the first and second things anyways, and that story will help remember the middle. If it makes sense, and if you've got a story to use and to tell to illustrate a point that you're making in the middle of your lesson, absolutely use it. 100%, it is a great way to engage your learning audience with concepts and ideas. You can also have your participants tell their own stories, to use their own experiences, because it will help engage. Sometimes people don't want to hear from the teacher anymore. They want to hear from their peers. Where was their experience? What have they learned? And having them share their experiences and their stories is a great way to keep them involved, to think about their own experience as learners and become teachers. Don't just tell a story though for the sake of telling a story. There's far too many amazing storytellers out there in Hollywood, in New York, wherever else the entertainment is happening. So leave the entertainers to do the entertaining as far as storytelling is concerned. Be entertaining when you're doing it, but have an educational value to the story that you tell. Now, as far as digital storytelling is concerned, what I'm doing right now is a form of digital storytelling. It's just regular storytelling that you would normally do with digital tools. Now, there's so many tools out there. There's so much software, digital cameras, our cell phones now, voice recorders. You can use iMovie, Windows Movie Maker, Final Cut. I'm using a program called Snagit that Tobin told me about that he uses for his videos. YouTube, Vimeo. There are so many different things that enable us as teachers to digitally engage and digitally convey our stories to our learners. There's a wide application for distance learning, and I think it's heavily important to make a note that telling a story and being a storyteller and being engaging and having and conveying that emotion and showing and letting your voice be heard and your face be seen is incredibly important. Um, it's more engaging than simply writing a story out and having students read it. There's plenty of types of digital stories. There's personal narratives where you tell your own experience. I told you at the beginning of this presentation of my own experience with my teacher. You could tell a historical theme or event such as George Washington or chopping down the cherry tree. And then stories that inform or instruct. My teacher made up a story to illustrate a point of how to spell a word. So there's several different ways and types of stories that you can tell that work fantastically well. There's many steps in creating a digital story. I won't dive too terribly far in, but you can define, collect, and decide is one way to do it, which is basically define what it is you're trying to teach, collect different artifacts, sound bites, stories, and then decide what is best to include and convey the story. You can select, import, and create. Select the different things that you want, import them into your story, and then create the story around those things. You can decide, write, record, and finalize. Decide what it is you're looking for. Write the story out, record it, whether it's video or audio solely, and then finalize that. Some main elements of a digital story. Pretty straightforward point of view. You could give it from the point of view of the person that went through it. You could do it from first person point of view where I tell you a story that actually happened to me and give you my experience. You could pose a dramatic question and then use a story to answer that question and serve your lesson. You could use emotional content. Draw on the emotions of your audience. Elicit that heartstring pulling story. Make them angry to get them involved. Use humor. Some sort of emotional content is always a great way to help people memorize or learn what it is you're trying to teach. Now, the gift of your voice, I think, is something that cannot be understated, especially in distance learning. It's great to be able to get on discussion boards and talk with people and read all of this wonderful, enriching content, but there is no substitute, as far as I'm concerned, for being able to put a face and a voice to who's behind facilitating those discussion boards. Who is it that is talking to us, is grading our papers, is giving us this feedback? I don't know you, but you're grading and judging my papers. But then you have videos like Tobin does, where now when I read what he's written on a discussion board, or when I read what he's written as far as a comment on a paper or a presentation that I've done, I can put that voice to it. I can put the personality that he's conveyed into that, and it makes it much easier to understand and to engage. The economy of story detail, the pacing, selection of quality images, all very important. Pacing especially. If you go too fast, you're going to lose people. If you go too slow, people are going to drop off because they get bored. It's one of those things that you need to be aware of. And I know a lot of times people will speak too fast if they're nervous. They'll speak too slow to overcompensate for things like that. So it's one of those things you need to be aware of. Also, the selection of quality images. Make sure that if you're using images to put on your PowerPoint or on a handout while you tell a story, make sure that they relate to that. They're not just pretty pictures for the sake of having pretty pictures. Make them images that help to serve your story. Here's a little bit more on digital storytelling, some resources, and I will put this PowerPoint on the discussion board after I've posted this video, and you can check out all of these different resources. I encourage you to do so. Storytelling is a fantastic way to have people remember and learn. So here are some of our references, but I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you all are able to use storytelling in your future teaching and training, and find it to be a helpful way to convey everything that you are trying to teach. You've all have so much experience that people want to know what it is you know. And one of the best ways to tell them is through storytelling. Not just to tell them what you know, but how you learned it, what process you went through to get there. So use your stories, your personal story, as a way to teach and get people engaged and knowledgeable. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you on the discussion boards. Thanks.